Welcome to this second session of the Freeman Seminar series for this year. I'm delighted to have as our guest Professor Chris Roberts from the law school. Professor Roberts is uniquely qualified to talk in a public policy setting of this kind. He has a PhD in sociology and public policy, as well as his training in the law. When Chris came to this seminar a couple of years ago, he based his remarks on his very well-received book, The Contentious History of the International Bill of Human Rights, which was published by Cambridge University Press. Somewhat unusually, he's not moving ahead in time in terms of his talk today, but rather backward in time. And he's going to be talking about a kind of prequel to his previous research. And in particular, he's going to be contrasting the views of two prominent Americans, Arthur Hayes Sulzberger and E.B. White, with the four freedoms as propounded by Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal. This is a fascinating subject, and I think we'll all profit from it. Here's Professor Roberts.
The banner of a certain rights claim. How do you study that? I don't have an answer for that, or I didn't have an answer for that, but that's what the book is focused on, and I'm going to take you through my research and also through my process of discovery, in which I have figured out ways to answer these questions of understanding what becomes of rights, how rights are created, before we even know what the rights are. And it sounds abstract, but in principle and in practice, I suggest that we're in one of these pre-rights moments today. Major rights moments pop up every several decades. You have founding in the United States. You have the Reconstruction period. You have women's suffrage, the civil rights movement. These are periodic things that cycle through our society, and there is a rights moment, a major rights moment, that's up ahead somewhere. But at this point, we can't see it, we don't know exactly what it is, and maybe we don't even know what the rights are that are in this rights moment that lies ahead. But if we look back at history, we know it's coming. And one of the most important things about this supposition is that rights are not just for the downtrodden and oppressed. Rights can be for corporations, rights can be for those in power, the elites, it can be for dictators, rights can be for white nationalists. And so we can't rest on our laurels and think that if there's a rights moment that's in our future, it's going to be for the rights that we ourselves would want to fight for. And that's where I sort of begin this project. And I've been doing a lot of speaking with students who ask me, what should I do to be involved in a moment like this? What do I need to do? How can I pull the levers of the political and social engines that guide us in order to do something? And I say, well, you have to know what's coming, what's ahead. So if we look what's ahead, part of this picture is the road kind of dies out. We don't know what's ahead. But I've been doing some research, and this is just by way of introduction, about what's ahead in academic thought. So I have done some research on the forthcoming books. There's a huge database that has every single forthcoming book that has a publisher and has a Library of Congress number. And what I found is there's a lot of talk about the end of, the last, the decline, the demise of almost everything you can think of. Here, I didn't want to put it up, but there are about 80 different titles that are coming out in the next year or two. Titles about the end of Christendom, the end of British rule, the death of public integrity, the end times, a brief guide to the end of the world, the end of empire, the end of the democratic state, the end of Middle East history, the end of culture, the end of modernity, the end of law, the death of affirmative action, and so on and so forth. I mean, pretty much anything you can think of. And so my question and my worry now is that when we start talking in these terms, and we really already have. There are books that have already come out, The Decline of Western Liberalism, The End of Capitalism. What do we do with that? I mean, how do we engage in a productive conversation when there is so much to be down about? So in my research now, I am looking for instances of major social change in which people are going through similar situations that are uncertain, where they don't know what comes next. And with the 4 freedoms, with human rights, this is a perfect way to get into this topic. And so, by way of a somewhat long introduction, let me just dive into some of the research and some of the modern things. So this is something that the librarian a few days ago at the law school, he knew I was looking into this. So it's not just me. Booksellers have also noted that there are a lot of ideas about what's coming and not being so keen on the future. But we go back to 1948 when the Universal Declaration was created. And go back not to the signing, not to the moments after, not to what most of the history focuses on. So it's sort of the triumph. But we go back to the moments before, where before the Declaration was signed. This is John Humphrey. His archives are in McGill University. I visited the archives and looked at his spiral-bound stenographic notebooks, his notes about what happened during and after the signing of the Declaration of Human Rights. And here we have a brief entry, December 10th, where he says he dined with Hersch Lauderpack. So right before the Universal Declaration was passed, he had dinner with Hersch Lauderpack at the Gourmet Saint-Chic, and Humphrey says he's very pessimistic about the work of the United Nations on human rights, but out of friendliness for me, he tried to be pleasant. He writes, Lauderpack is unreal in his thinking, and I sincerely hope that history will prove what he is, that he is wrong. He has no idea whatsoever of the political difficulties involved, nor does he want to know about them. And in my first book, I remembered when I was there that Lauderpack had a lot of misgivings, a lot of problems with the Universal Declaration, and chief among those was that it wasn't binding. And so there is a scene in the book where he is writing to his son about how he is physically and mentally down and out. This is just before the dinner with Humphrey. And his son recognized that he was undoubtedly, it was undoubtedly a disappointment for his father. He had been passed over for a job with with Great Britain and their delegation because he was Jewish. And so you think about a universal compact of rights that prescribes no discrimination, and then you have the most qualified person in the world being passed over because of his religion. Lauderpack writes in a private letter, the cumulative result of sleeplessness is beginning to tell. I simply dread the night. He says, this kind of work draws upon itself uniformly adverse criticism. It will be assailed by the orthodox as going too far, by the progressive as being too conservative and evasive, by the lawyers as being revolutionary, by the laymen as being too legalistic. I'll take this all so philosophically, but I am in danger of reaching a stage of doubting whether all of this is or was worthwhile. And so you see in his notes, his private letters, this marked distinction between how he's feeling and then how he presents himself in his actual work, in his actual scholarship. He's strong, he's certain, he knows that human rights are the right way to go in the world, and then in private he has these doubts and these uncertainties and these hesitations that are making him feel physically ill. He doesn't know if he wants to go on. John Humphrey has the same thing. And when I go to the archives and I see people who, on the one hand, write with strength, but then on the other hand, in their private lives, have questions, doubts, and uncertainties, the feeling that they're feeling, or at least what it seems that they're feeling, is a feeling that I think is familiar for those of us who are in a moment of change, where we know there are things that are happening that are beyond our control, and it's difficult to know which way to push, which way to go, and what to do. That's what I've been looking for in the archives for this book that I'm working on right now. I'm looking for people who are having that struggle, having that dilemma, confronting them, and trying to figure out how to push forward, what to do. Is it human rights that we should be focusing on? Is it something else? And thinking about the struggles and the uncertainties that all of us as citizens, as thinkers, as academics go through in a moment of change. And what I found with Arthur Hayes Sulzberger, the publisher of the New York Times, is a lot of this hesitation, a lot of this uncertainty, and really an emotional roller coaster that he goes through when he talks and thinks about the four freedoms. This is too small for you to read, but it is a letter to the Times. So remember, Sulzberger is the publisher of the Times. This is from 1961, and this is on the eve of when there's a plaque that's going up for the Four Freedoms in New York in honor of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who came up with the Four Freedoms. And Sulzberger writes in this letter to the editor, "I don't like the prize-winning design of the FDR Memorial. What bothers me more, though, are the words that are undoubtedly going to be inscribed on these monstrous slates. Up to the time of Mr. Roosevelt, the First Amendment to our Constitution had provided four fundamental freedoms for all of us: freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and freedom of assembly. But at the apex of the dictator's power abroad, in 1941, Mr. Roosevelt saw fit to drop two: freedom of the press and of assembly, and substitute instead freedom from fear and freedom from want." This was something that I saw during the first book, and it was a curiosity. But I now know why he had such animosity towards Franklin Delano Roosevelt. It was because Arthur Hayes Sulzberger thought of the Four Freedoms himself. It was his quote-unquote brainchild. And when I found this out from the archives, it was a shock to me, because there is no book on human rights and the Four Freedoms, and there are many books on human rights and the Four Freedoms. There are lengthy tomes just on the Four Freedoms. None of them mention Sulzberger. In my book, I talk about FDR's Four Freedoms, because everyone else talks about FDR's Four Freedoms. But it was Sulzberger who came up with the Four Freedoms, and FDR who came and took them and changed them around to make them much broader a concept for mass appeal to help mobilize the war effort. And this is a major part of the book that I'm telling the story, bringing it to light. Not because I think of Sulzberger as a hero, not because I think of FDR as a villain or anything on that plane, but there's an important history here of uncertainty, not knowing what is going to be the idea or the thing that leads us to the kind of future that we want. And both Sulzberger and FDR are gambling on a set of ideas and concepts. And I would argue that in our moment right now, we as a society don't have a set of ideas or concepts that we have decided upon or agreed upon that will be our vehicle forward to help us move all together at once when we need to as a society. And that's something that the Four Freedoms that Roosevelt envisioned helped to do. And it's something that Arthur Hayes Sulzberger, up to his death, never forgave Roosevelt for taking. So we have Arthur Sulzberger here. This is just a file photo. And I'm just going to share a few articles, a few documents. And again, you're not supposed to be able to read those, but these are the documents from the archives. It just kind of tells the emotional roller coaster that Sulzberger goes on when he thinks up this idea of the Four Freedoms. It's September 30th, 1943, and November 25th, 1936, sorry. And Sulzberger is just about to give a speech to the Columbia Alumni Association. They've asked him to talk on something having to do with freedom of the press, And he comes up with this alliterative phrase, the four freedoms, and shares it with the planners for the 1939 World's Fair, and says, maybe there's something we can do with this idea. I hope that something may come of my brainchild, the four freedoms. One cannot look abroad these days and not appreciate the blessings bestowed upon this country by reason of our Bill of Rights. Maybe we can have some statues. Maybe we can have some sort of memorial at the World's Fair in 1939 that memorializes these four freedoms. So this, you might be able to read that. That's where it says, I hope something can come of my brainchild, the four freedoms. And this is 4 or 5 years before Franklin Roosevelt came out with the Four Freedoms. We have a document December 30th, 1936, where the planners of the 1939 World's Fair say, we had a meeting and the committee reported that we might be able to commemorate the Four Freedoms. We might be able to do something with it. And we have another document here which says that Arthur Hayes Sulzberger talked to Governor Whalen about the Four Freedoms and asked if there was anything that he could do at the World's Fair about the Four Freedoms. And another letter, this is the postscript, just to show you how much of a bug I am on the Four Freedoms. I'm enclosing a copy of the speech which I made yesterday. This was the Four Freedoms to the Columbia Alumni Association. He then emailed Henry Morgenthau, who was Secretary of the Treasury, and knew that he had a direct ear to President Roosevelt. Anytime he wanted Roosevelt to know something, he would go through Henry Morgenthau. And here he says, I'm enclosing a copy of the speech that I talked about, the Four Freedoms. I know you recently had a speech which talked about similar things, but mine was written before I saw yours, so it doesn't represent any stealing. So he has something that he thinks is valuable. He wants to protect it. And this is just a document from many years before, 1933, where he sends a letter to Morgenthau. And he hadn't come up with the Four Freedoms as the name, but he said, if the president could set aside a proclamation this year, 1937, for the observation of the Constitution, and he could emphasize freedom of liberty, freedom of worship, freedom of expression, freedom of the press, it would quicken the hearts of all those who are now depressed by the outrages of Hitlerism. So Sulzberger here was extremely pleased with what he was thinking. And his idea of the Four Freedoms get memorialized in the 1939 World's Fair, where you have sort of hope and optimism about the future. This is a smoking robot. We have a whole exhibit on the miracles of asbestos. You can see asbestos there. And a big part of the fair was Futurama, thinking about what's coming next. What is our future going to be like? And General Motors had an outsized presence there where they envisioned the city and the country of tomorrow as being a network of highways and freeways that combine, that connect every city and metropolis, and built a replica model of one of these cities that they envisioned. You can see the people looking in below at the work there. And we have the Four Freedoms. And so this was a way that Arthur Hayes Sulzberger was able to get his idea out there, to put it not in concrete. Those were just plaster statues that actually, after the fair, ended up getting rained on and sort of melted and withered away. But the Four Freedoms had a presence there. We have freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom of assembly, and freedom of the press. How are we doing on time? So we go until what?
Till 2.
Till 2. Okay, great.
One time for questions.
Okay. So I'm going to pause here and sort of change gears a little bit and tell another quick story about E.B. White. And it's a little disjointed here because I'm trying to take some important aspects of the book, different chapters, and tell how they all intertwine with one another. But we know E.B. White from his children's books, from Elements of Style, but he was also the lead notes and comments editor of the New Yorker. And so he would report on matters, public matters. He would report on politics. And one of the things, this is another thing that sort of caught my attention and was something that I couldn't explain when I was doing my research in the first book, and that was why he was so against the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. He said, we agree, this is the 1950s, we agree fully with President Eisenhower and Mr. Dulles that the United States should stay away from international covenants on human rights. And it seems he's putting himself on the wrong side of history here. You make a statement like that, the membership of the League is such that a Bill of Rights is not a Bill of Rights at all. It's a bill of hopes and a bill of compromise. In our opinion, and he always talked in first person plural in the notes and comments section of the New Yorker, in our opinion, the UN Commission on Human Rights drifted into the same error that Franklin Roosevelt fell into when he dreamed up his 4 freedoms. FDR tried manfully to mix principles and goals. So this is another thing that really surprised me, and that was when we see E.B. White, who's very liberal, writing for the New Yorker, talking about freedom of speech, freedom of worship, with the inexact and unmanageable goals of freedom from want and freedom from fear. He says those two things, those two categories shouldn't be together. That's E.B. White. E.B. White also was the author of the first publication on the 4 freedoms that came out from the Office of War Information in President Roosevelt's government. The Office of War Information was the kind of propaganda unit. They used that term propaganda at the time. It didn't have the same, as negative a connotation as it does now. But he was chosen by members of the government to write the pamphlet, and his job was to write the part on freedom of speech. After E.B. White wrote it, the idea of 4 freedoms, and this is Roosevelt's idea of 4 freedoms, that has freedom from fear and freedom from want, dropping freedom from the press. It became really big. It became a public sort of display where Norman Rockwell even got in and painted several pictures that represent the 4 freedoms. They were used for war bonds. If this looks like Gregory Peck, it is. Norman Rockwell used him as the model for the everyman freedom of speech, freedom of worship. This is also a Rockwell painting. Arthur Hayes Sulzberger, watching all of this, watching the government go into full mobilization with the 4 freedoms, printing out 200,000 copies of the 4 freedoms pamphlet that E.B. White wrote, and going through all of the PR work that the Office of War Information could put forth as reason to send our soldiers to war, was watching this and fell increasingly unhappy and increasingly despondent about what he was seeing and how his idea, his brainchild, was getting usurped by the president. And one of the things about Sulzberger that was, his biographers say, was deep in his psychology was that he married into the family that controlled the New York Times. And he got that position because, not because of talent, but just because of a connection between a family, and his wife did not get that position because she was a woman. And that was clear as day. She said that in public, and he really had insecurities, so much so that in most of the speeches he gave, he mentioned that the only reason he's here is because of whom he married, almost to sort of to quell what he thought was already in other people's mind. And so you see when he grabs onto the 4 freedoms, he's thinking, this is something important. I have received dozens, if not hundreds, of letters from people around the country saying this is a good idea. We've printed it in newspapers. And then Roosevelt comes along with a much bigger government apparatus to project out his vision of the 4 freedoms. And this here is a letter from August 8th, 1942, where he is writing to a person in the Office of War Information, Elmer Davis, and he says, "You have disappointed me." This is Sulzberger writing. When we last talked about the Four Freedoms pamphlet, I asked you if they were the original Four Freedoms that I had thought of. You told me I needn't worry, the pamphlet was receiving excellent attention, but I've seen the pamphlet and my Four Freedoms are gone. This is Roosevelt's Four Freedoms. Davis replies and says, as for which of the Four Freedoms are basic and which are upstarts, there might be some difference in our philosophy. Personally, when anyone mentions the Four Freedoms to me, I always think of the four plaster ladies at Governor Whalen's World Fair and have to pause and reflect. But I think freedom of the press was adequately recovered. So there's a big dig to Sulzberger there. And we have another set of letters where he is invited to talk about the Four Freedoms. And he replies that he cannot, let's see, where are we? I have your letter of May 26th, and I'm sorry that I can't help you out with the talk that I'm invited to. To do so would run counter to a little private war of mine. And then he goes into this letter about how Roosevelt stole his Four Freedoms. Another letter, when I read the leading article to the editor and publisher last Friday, I was surprised to note that the press was prepared to give up the original Four Freedoms and accept the new ones that do not specifically include freedom of the press. That's a concession that I, for one, have never been ready to make. So what do we make of all this? Why is it important? For one, with the history that we have on the Four Freedoms, it doesn't talk about Sulzberger. It doesn't talk about any of this. And if we're thinking about continuity, if we're thinking about impact, big deal. Sulzberger had a different version of the Four Freedoms. It didn't really have the impact that FDR's does. But if we're thinking about how to do research, and we're thinking about concepts, where concepts and ideas come from, and how we as historians or scholars or citizens think back to the moments of inception of a particular idea, it says a lot, because there is a sort of prehistory before much of the rights history that we focus on that doesn't deal with the rights. It might deal with other kinds of words, other concepts, freedoms, liberties, and so forth. But if we begin at the rights moment, if we begin at the Universal Declaration and look forward, or if we begin at the moment when the suffragettes started to march for the right to vote, as opposed to looking before that at the preconditional landscape that was created and the preconditions that allowed people to even think of the right to vote for women in the first place, or the freedom to not feel like you're in want, for example. You have to go back much further than the typical histories go. You have to go back further than the Universal Declaration. You have to go back to this moment of uncertainty where these prior concepts are being battled over and fought over. I recently went back and looked at Hannah Arendt's Origins of Totalitarianism. She said something in the preface that I have never noticed before, but I think is highly relevant for us now. And she says, I could only start writing this book in 1945, after the war, after the tumult and the chaos of it. She said it wasn't just because of the location, and her life was turned head over heels. She said before then, in the 20s and the 30s, she didn't have the framework, she didn't have the ideas or the mental grammar to even understand or capture what was going on at the time. And that really stuck out for me, because someone as brilliant as Hannah Arendt saying that there was a moment of 2 decades where she didn't have the mental grammar, she didn't have the words or the framework to know what was going on, said something about those of us who are living in a moment of change. And I think that is extremely important for our moment of change right now, because when we watch TV, when we watch Rachel Maddow or Fox News or whatever it is, and we are getting reports of what's happening. We're getting reports of what's happening at one level, but the big picture of what's happening is a question mark. I mean, I can't tell you how many conversations I end where we both agree, that's crazy, and then the conversation is over. I mean, we don't have this bigger framework to put what's going on now. And I think there are candidates for it, but that's what Sulzberger and FDR were trying to do, I think, with this idea of four freedoms. They were trying to figure out what is a conceptual vessel that lives in our common experience where we can understand and put the things that don't otherwise make sense into today, or back then in the late 30s and 40s, to understand what's going on and what we're actually to do if we want to pull the levers of our politics, of our laws, of society, in order to move forward and see what we should be doing now to affect the future. And this ultimately is obviously a work in progress, both in terms of my work here, but in terms of hearing about other people's experiences, what struggles and challenges they're going through, and how we can solve what I call the 51-49% problem. And that is on almost any issue that you can possibly think of in our country, it's difficult, if not impossible, to get more than 50% of the public really on board with something. And you can probably think of many examples where it's not, but on the important issues, we're divided. And there are certain issues that need more than 50%. They need 80, 90, 95% of the population to agree with to move forward. And if we're stuck around 50%, give or take, that is a huge problem. Prior to the Four Freedoms, prior to the 1940s, our country was stuck at around 50%. But there were several things, the Four Freedoms was one of them, that provided a conceptual basket that allowed people to say, yes, I can get on board with these things and we can move together. What that will be for us, I don't know. But that broad question is what has really animated this work and this project that I'm working on right now, and I think the question still remains open. So I'd like to open it up for questions and feedback, comments, thoughts, and hear anything that you have to say about this. Do you want me to call, or? Yeah.
Well, I recently read a book by Yuval Harari called *Sapiens*, and there's a section in there that has always confused me, and so I don't know if you're familiar with it, but so he addresses human rights, and he says human rights are a direct result of liberal humanism, which is a direct legacy of traditional Christian beliefs in the free and eternal human souls. Do you know what he means by that? I mean, he does go on to say, we hear much talk about inalienable and fundamental rights, and history shows that neither adjective has an application to rights or any other law or system which has been created by human imagination. He points out every imagined hierarchy disavows its fictional origins and claims to be unnatural and inevitable. Hammurabi's laws were ordained by his gods. To Aristotle, a slave had to submit to that status because of his innate slavish nature, whereas free people had a free nature. These days we insist that these were mistaken views of long-dead civilizations, but the very fact that we insist on a particular bundle of fundamental rights means that we are obeying this rule to the letter, since our cherished principles such as free speech only exist in our imagination. They could turn on a dime under sufficient duress. They can vanish in a day. Look at what happened to free press after Charlie Hebdo.
Yeah, so I think without reading more, what he's getting at the sort of broad level is that human rights are what we say they are. They can be given, they can be taken away. But I think he's touching on something extremely important, and that is, if we can figure out a concept, or if anybody can figure out a concept that people believe is natural. You can naturalize this concept, this idea, and say that we are fundamentally about this to the level of our individual person and being. Or we are given these by God or any other power. What you're doing is you're taking a concept, you're taking an idea of how we are to associate and live together and putting it on a shelf out of reach. So if you say that these rights are God-given, no mortal can take them away. You're putting the right on the shelf, but what he's saying is, well, we can believe that, but a dictator can come and take them right away. And so part of it, I think, is that we have to figure out, and this gets to, I think, a much deeper and broader debate, and perhaps he's addressing this now, is that what do human rights supporters do in a moment when human rights are in crisis? Do human rights supporters say these are God-given rights that no one can take away, double down on how natural, fundamental they are, and everybody should believe them and buy into them? Or recognize that the very need to have them in the first place presupposes that a lot of people do otherwise and don't buy into them? That weakens the sort of protective rhetoric, that weakens the idea that they're on this shelf and they're God-given, if you recognize that there are those that don't believe in them, and if you put them in any other category than being wrong, being evil, you're kind of breaking down the basic foundations of what you have given as strength for the rights in the first place. And so it's a difficult dilemma. And for the first time, I've heard international relations scholars asking the question, if we think about from the end of World War II to the present, is this the moment of change that is an anomaly, or is what happened before an anomaly? I mean, if we look at the broader scope of history, we have several decades of international human rights. And that is a tiny, tiny, tiny fragment of a much, much broader history. And so the question is, one question that's being asked is our moment right now, when we presuppose that everyone has a fundamental right, is this an anomaly? Is this going to go away, or are we going to go back to something before? And there's a question mark, I think.
Thanks.
Thank you.
This is a very simple question.
Those are always the hardest.
It doesn't have to do with idiosyncrasies of particular personalities or insecurities or anything like that. But it does seem that one of the distinctions between the two freedoms, the two sets of freedom, is traditional liberties. And in the second set, you have bootleg obligations by others for material support, the freedom from want. And isn't that just the distinction between social democracy and traditional liberalism or something? I mean, the freedom from fear part maybe has to do with the war. I'm not sure exactly what that's about. But can you comment on that elementary distinction?
Yeah. I mean, the way that rights scholars now look at it is you have freedom froms and freedom to. So freedom from government, traditional civil liberties, freedom to do certain things with welfare, social economic rights. And so that is a major fault line that is being addressed here. And I think more so with E.B. White's criticism than Sulzberger's, perhaps. But they're saying that the Constitution, this is more Sulzberger's argument, the Constitution has these traditional rights in it, the First Amendment rights. It doesn't have freedom from fear, freedom from want. We need to stay true to the Constitution. Looking at his writings, he's more interested in freedom of the press, and I think could deal with freedom from want and freedom from fear. If freedom from the press, I don't think he'd have any complaints about that. But you have these fault lines that I think allow people to make their arguments, even if that's not what they're necessarily fighting over. You know, there are these fault lines that exists between traditional rights, traditional civil rights, and then economic social rights. And Sulzberger is using that division for his argument, but at the same time, it's pretty clear in his writings that it's freedom of speech that he's most interested in. But I think you're absolutely right that we're in large part talking about a new set of principles that FDR articulated in the New Deal and tried to really institutionalize and export to the world after the war and the creation of the Universal Declaration.
So what was White's position on the New Deal?
So White was a supporter of the New Deal. He was extremely liberal. But he believed, like Lauterpacht, in if you make a promise or you have a compact that's written, you need to guarantee it. And he said that you can't have a right without somebody else having a duty, an obligation, and wrote in the New Yorker that a right is a responsibility in reverse. You have to have both of them. And so Lauterpacht was the same way. He said, we don't want just statements of principles here. We want to have law that's enforced by sanction, where somebody else has the legal duty, the legal obligation to see to it that those rights are enforced. And E.B. White is, I think, kind of making the same argument there.
So in a more general sense, do you think that we require a cataclysmic event, such as a world war, to get the language of our rights back in shape? Like Hannah Arendt said, she didn't have the language until after the World War. And is that something that you think will need to happen before we can figure out what these rights are going to be and to go beyond the 50-50 support to the 80-20 support?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question, and one that I struggle a lot with. I mean, I hope not, but at the same time, I mean, you see it over and over again in politics and history that something needs to really break before we end up getting mobilized to fix it. And so I don't know. I mean, I think that part of it, and this is the optimistic side, is that you can define what broken is. And so maybe there are things now that are so broken, but based on our older paradigms, the older rules that we're all kind of stuck in, they look fine. It looks like we're driving down the road just fine. Until you have an idea or a concept that shifts the way we look at it and changes the way we see things, to see that actually these things are extremely broken, these things are terrible. Maybe Me Too does that. You know, I mean, there's pervasive sexual discrimination, there's pervasive abuse that goes on between gender relations, and it has been for forever. But we're looking at that differently now, and it's been broken for a long time. But maybe it's just maybe we have a new perspective on it, a much needed perspective, and maybe we need that in a lot of other areas where we can actually see how broken things are without getting to
so it's actually a lack of leadership that doesn't,
Maybe you should repeat the question. I'm afraid that the light may be two directions.
Okay. So say that again.
is it a lack of leadership then? Somebody leading without this cataclysmic event occurring to create these opportunities and create a language that we can go behind versus what we're seeing now?
Okay, so the question is it a lack of leadership? Is it a lack of somebody leading so we can see things in a different light? I don't think so. I mean, I think that leadership can come from many different venues, many different fora, but what I see in the history, and I think perhaps I see today, is that there are isolated individual experiences that people are having where the rules don't work for them, the system doesn't work for them, and they start to find other people who have that same experience, and that same experience is shared, it becomes known as a common experience, and people actually see themselves not as individuals in the suffering, in whatever state they're in, but they see it as a common experience, and the I becomes a we. And when that we can form, when somebody can say, my situation is our situation, my problems are our problems, that's where I see the room for change. That's where I see leaders grabbing onto that, and people like Roosevelt through all sorts of focus studies, and Elmer Roper helped him with public opinion, seeing that people are afraid, and so banding that together in a concept. But I think it comes from the ground up, at least in the moments that I'm looking from. Yes.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I have a question concerning the possibility of limitation of freedom. Why I'm asking, because I represent of other culture, yeah? And what do you think? Is it need to limit freedom when we, for example, provide freedom for one part of society, and this freedom can be not respectful for other side? For example, when we legalize use and sale marijuana, or when we legalize the same sex marriage, yes, it's good for one part of society, but other part don't like it. Can we freedom a reason of instability in society, and should we think before when we provide this freedom?
Right. So I like this question. Let me.
Can you repeat it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the question is, do we need to limit freedom? When we talk about freedom, we often talk about it as a very expansive term, but does it need to have parameters on it? Is my freedom going to necessarily infringe upon others? When FDR first came out with his 4 freedoms, it was at a press conference in 1940, and he talked about the 4 freedoms, and actually he had a 5th in there that he dropped later. But
Can you tell us what it was? I'm curious.
It was the right for economic movement. He was thinking about transportation and sort of free trade, but it didn't ring and resonate as the others. But he talked about the freedoms, and then he talked about the limitations of those freedoms. He said every freedom has limitation. You can have freedom of speech and worship as long as my beliefs and speech don't harm other people, and went through it that way. And what they thought was that doesn't really ring well. When we talk about freedom of speech, we want to talk about freedom of speech. We don't want to talk about all the limitations. But absolutely, there are always going to be limitations. And I think where those concepts become extremely powerful is when they become naturalized, when people I feel what freedom of speech is, and who should have it and who shouldn't have it. And it becomes sort of a presupposition as to what members of society have these freedoms, what members don't, and we don't even need to talk about it, we just know it, we just feel it together. And that's perhaps the insidious nature of it, but then also what makes it so powerful as well, that we can all know what it is without saying what it is. We can feel what it is, but you certainly will have exclusions. And so that's a huge part of this. But at the same time, if you talk about the limitations, it weakens the power of a quote-unquote universal concept.
Talked a bit about the idea of rights not necessarily being for oppressed peoples or downtrodden peoples. When you survey the contemporary landscape, what do you see in terms of examples of alternative attempts to define and interpret what rights are?
I just yesterday on the radio heard Mitt Romney talking. He was answering questions from reporters and members of the public. And he said, corporations are people. And then you heard some people say, no, they're not, what are you talking about? And he said, of course they're people, absolutely they're people. Who gets paid? It's their shareholders. Corporations are the people, they're their shareholders, they're their principals. And I mean, he was gonna go to the map for this. And so that's an example. Whether you agree or disagree, it doesn't matter, but I think one of the issues or one of the problems that I've run into when I talk to other human rights supporters, and I consider myself a great human rights supporter, but I don't necessarily have all the same orthodox views, is when I say Does it worry you? And I had this conversation with a very well-known human rights scholar. Does it worry you when you see in Charlottesville the guys that are holding the torches saying that we are fighting for human rights? We are fighting for the white nation. And the response was, he kind of laughed. Those aren't rights. But what happens if enough people think that they're rights, that they're willing to fight for the rights, and they're willing to do what happened in Charlottesville? And I mean, there's something going on there that is crucial. And we can't get stuck in a notion of what we think rights are and not see what other people are fighting for in terms of rights. And I think that is one of the things that the human rights community has to come to terms with, or at least figure out how to effectively deal with, while not conceding, but at the same time recognizing that there are different notions of rights that are gaining a lot of power and authority. And we have Trump and his Commission on Unalienable Rights right now, where he is, in the State Department, seeks to redefine and rename what international human rights are, not in the post-World War II sense, but in the traditional sense of natural rights. So what's going on with that? Maybe nothing will happen, but there's a project going on to rename what human rights are, and I think that's something that we definitely need to watch. I saw a hand in the back. Or, how are we on time?
No, could you say a bit more? You said that Roper had helped Roosevelt understand where the public was on these issues. Freedom from fear has always puzzled me a bit. Can you put that into context? Obviously, this was a terrible time in the 30s and 40s. But what exactly was fear supposed to encompass, and for whom was it supposed to be? Did it mean the same things to Americans, for example, that meant to somebody living in Central Europe?
Right. I'm just going to pull up a quick photograph here to answer your question, or to illustrate. So that's one of these images. I'm going to pull up another one there. Actually, that's a Roosevelt press conference. But if I can make that a little bit bigger, and but this was the summer of 1940, and when this image hit the press, I mean, it sent shockwaves. There were people who said it could not happen, this is fake. But I mean, with the idea of, I think this is what people had in their minds. Norman Rockwell in his painting, I mean, you can only take the painting so far, but at the same time, he was amazing at capturing a sort of sense or a consciousness amongst a certain subset of the American population, white suburban, for example. But he has in Freedom from Fear a picture, maybe I can go back to it, because it's extremely evocative and I think perceptive. So if we go back, I don't know, bigger. But so the father is holding a newspaper. It says bombings, horror hit. They're tucking their kids in. There's sort of a rag doll there. People getting sent off to war. I think that just all these images that come through in the press, the world is changing before our eyes, and there's this force that's marching across Europe. But I don't know if that's too literal in terms of answering your question, but yeah. And then there's one in the back too.
Yeah, so let's kind of go back to your comment before. Like, is there a framework that exists that has this broader definition of rights? Because one thing that I was thinking about when you brought that question up was the ACLU's decision to defend Milo Yiannopoulos, and the controversy that ensued after that, even though he is, according to them, just using his right to free speech, And so how do you maintain like legitimacy among like progressive human rights circles while also expanding the dialogue around what rights are and who they are for?
Right. So what you're asking is there is a tension between having this idea of universal rights, or everybody has the right to free speech, but then when you give it or grant it to certain people who say odious and hateful things or harmful things, maybe it loses some of its legitimacy?
Yes. Like, well, how do you like maintain that legitimacy like with the public that is saying like this is like hateful speech, these are like bad things? Like, how do you maintain the people backing that like these are rights that need to be protected for everybody?
Yeah. No, it's a great question. There recently has been a lot of talk about quote unquote free speech fundamentalism. And that is the idea that kind of gets back to your point about freedom. And that is, if we believe in free speech, we believe in free speech for everybody and anybody, and unless it is a clear and present threat to somebody's physical harm or safety, we must allow it to go forward. We must protect it.
But it's so uncomfortable. That's like that is so uncomfortable.
And so so that would be the quote unquote free speech absolutist position, and the term free speech absolutist is a term that's used by people who consider themselves reasonable and moderate. So I mean the term is loaded, but at the same time the point is that we shouldn't necessarily have this John Stuart Mill idea that I'm free to swing my arm as far as I can until it hits somebody's nose. There is a different way that we need to look at it. There are mental, there are emotional harms, and there are harms of exclusion that can't be quantified. There aren't clear and immediate threats, but when you, and this is the example that's often given, when you are standing outside a polling area and you say, people of X, Y, and Z race, I know where you live, go home, don't vote. That is free speech. You're beyond the lines for people who are protesting or being political. But at the same time, that is a harm, and that has and can have a cumulative effect on whether people show up to exercise their right to vote. And so it's a difficult question, because I think one of the things that we are battling with as society now is, do we double down on the rights that we know, or do we moderate and be risk being called by those who double down as not one of us? Do we need to out-liberal the liberals and out-conservative the conservatives in order to be one of them? I think this is a battle that all of us are facing right now, and the argument of those who talk about this idea of free speech absolutism are saying, it's going to be the ruin of us all if we simply double down on the principles that we have had before this moment. We need to figure out a way, not necessarily to compromise, but to move to a different set of debates, a different set of fault lines with these. And I certainly don't have the answer for how to do that, but I think that's part of the struggle.
Well, thank you.